Welcome everyone to the Basics of Gardening. This is one of our first class that the Faulkner County Library is providing for gardening purposes, learning to garden. My name is Erica. I am your garden programmer presenter for the day. Thank you for being here. So this class is really about learning the basics of gardening. Anyone who wants to get a foothold or a basic grasp of the science behind gardening or indoor planting, and to get a feel of how it all works. Gardening is not a mystical thing. It is not some strange thing that, you're just lucky. Sometimes people who do have a quote green thumb are just lucky, but a lot of times they do know these basics that can help them throughout their gardening experience. So why garden? Why do you want to do this? Why am I showing you this? Gardening isn't really a standard in schools. A lot of us have taken earth science classes, but not everyone has really had a chance to experience gardens. Some of us grew up in apartment complexes where we never had our own yards. Others, that was something that was not for us. It was for our grandparents, our parents. Maybe it skipped a generation. We didn't get the chance to before we went off onto our own. So this is something that we can learn a little bit because we didn't get that chance growing up. This class is to make it easier on a new gardener. A lot of the new terminology can be overwhelming. And then going to things like our adult nonfiction section 635 in the library, those are the gardening books. And when you crack them open, you often will see this terminology that you don't understand. And they throw a lot of new words at you, and they don't often give a definition, or they explain it to you as if you already know what it is. This can be overwhelming, and it can be a barrier into gardening. This class is to help you get that basics down, so when you do go into it, you're not going to be overwhelmed. You have a little bit of understanding, and you can be able to take a look at a healthy plant and then look at a sick one and be like, okay, there's something wrong with it. Here, one of the biggest things you'll see when you're looking at plants, you'll see things like organic, open pollinated, heirloom, a lot of these words that if they are explained to you, they may not be explained correctly, or they may be someone's interpretation of the word. Open pollination is any pollination that occurs by insect, bird, wind, or other natural mechanisms. So there's no intentional pollination by humans. It is not artificial, artificial being by humans. This allows for a more genetically diverse seed because we're kind of just allowing the dice to roll wherever. There are no restrictions on the flow of pollen between the individuals, meaning that we're not selecting for anything. We're not going, oh, well, look at this flower, it's going over here. Nope, we're just letting the birds and bees do it. So why do we want this genetic diversity? Why do we want open pollination where things just allow themselves to be, where there's no selection, etc.? We want this because when there is more genetic diversity, when we're not specifically breeding two plants for specific traits, they're going to have more options in their genetic code. Maybe 50% of them will have a drought tolerance and 50% of them will have a flood resistance. This is really important, especially with climate change, with how our climate is going to be. It's not the overall increase in the climate temperature is going to cause a wider variety and more increase in severity of weather patterns. So where we used to have a lot of rain, we're going to have even more rain. Where we're going to have a drought, the drought is going to be longer and more severe. This is why it's super, super important to have a genetically diverse crop. Because when you have a genetically diverse crop, you have maybe 50% of your crop that is drought tolerant and 50% of it is flood tolerant. So in May, we get a bunch of storms and we get a flooding. 25% of our crop dies. Well, in June, we get a drought, and then 25% dies from that. We still have a crop. If we only had drought resistant, we had selected for one specific thing. If it flooded and it was not flood resistant, then our entire crop would die. We want to have that diversity because we have such a diversity in our weather patterns. As long as pollen is not shared between different varieties of the same species, then the seed produced will remain true to type year after year. If we have a yellow-colored cherry tomato with a red-colored cherry tomato, it'll create a seed that produces either yellow or red. But you don't know what genes are in that seed until you grow it into a plant. So if you were to crossbreed yellow and red, you're not going to know. If you give out 10 of those seeds, someone might get 40% yellow and 60% red. But they won't know. So you don't want to mix the different varieties if you're saving the seeds and you want a true to type seed year after year. This link contains a document of definitions for gardening with some explanations. This goes back to our Faulkner County Urban Farm Project Google Drive. There is a folder where you can take a look at the definitions. If you cannot click the link, we should have something provided in the description below where you can click it. Or we can have this be available on our Facebook page, which is also Faulkner County Urban Farm Project. If you've spoken to anyone in the gardening community, you'll often hear them talk very, very highly about heirloom seeds. Heirloom seeds are very important. My grandmother had heirloom seeds, etc. But what is the difference between heirloom and hybrid? Heirloom is the result of open pollination. They are typically grown in one particular place, and then the plants that have survived have bred, and their traits are specifically for that one microclimate. Here in Conway, Arkansas, we do have a lot of tomatoes. Say if we're growing out, we have a specific set of tomatoes that we grow in our backyard year after year for several years. The tomato plants that have thrived in that type of microclimate, we've saved the seeds of, and we plant them each year. And each year, it becomes more acclimated to our specific microclimate. That would change if we sent them over to California. Maybe they wouldn't grow as well there, but they are specifically for here. This is one of the reasons why if you say your grandpa have tomato seeds that they have heirloom that they've saved from generations in their small town in Wisconsin, and you bring them over to your little town in Arkansas and you plant them and they don't do well at all. This is because they have been grown to suit the Wisconsin climate, and they're not going to do super well in Arkansas. They're saved for their adaptive benefits, so they may actually do not super bad, but they're not going to thrive because they have adapted to a specific climate. They will have a greater genetic diversity, but they are still adapted slightly. Hybrids are the result of artificially crossing two plants together. These seeds, like we spoke in the previous slide, are not going to produce a true to type plant, just like the parents. These are bred for industrial traits, much like local grocers who ship their plants great distance. They're going to select for a specific type of gene for shelf life. If you take a tomato plant from a grocery store and try to grow it, it will not look like its parent plant because it was grown between two different plants, and it's going to look like either the mom or the father, not the parent plant or the plant that you took the seed from. It also reduces genetic diversity. This is going to be because you are selecting for a specific trait, and then you kind of let go of the other traits. It also can be detrimental because if you are selecting for a specific trait, say shelf life, this may also decrease the trait of tastiness. It may decrease the trait of, it may have more juice in it, or it may not have a lot of juice in it. It may be dry. Some of these traits we're not gonna, they're connected, and some of them aren't. So if you select for a certain trait, you may lose something else that you want. And of course, I am sure everyone here has heard of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and hybrids. Both are manipulation of the genes to select for a desired trait. However, hybrids do it via nature or humans through pollination, and this is something that you can do in your backyard. Genetically modified organisms are, you are taking a specific set of DNA in a lab and adding it to a piece of DNA that would have not otherwise come together, rather. Basically, if I took a squash plant and I had a squash plant that was getting eaten by a certain bug, well, I have a mushroom here that secretes a hormone, and these specific bugs do not like it. So I take the DNA that is including in that hormone, and I put it in my squash plant. Now that squash plant grows up and releases that hormone that repels the bugs. The idea behind GMOs is to have a specific set of traits that are useful. So does that mean all GMOs are bad? No. GMOs are often patented, meaning you cannot profit off of them if you don't own the patents. This has been very, very difficult for local farmers, where if they have their own corn, as we know, pollination can occur without human hands. Say if we have a crop next to us that is GMO and we don't have GMO plants, a wind comes and takes the pollinated pollen from the GMO plants and casts them onto our crop. Well, now our crop has the same DNA, the seeds from our crop has the same DNA as the GMOs. Thus, we cannot sell them, we cannot save the seed. This causes a lot of issues for farmers who just want to grow their own plants, but they can't because of this pollination. But it's patented because we have scientists who work very hard they spend a lot of money and trying to change this DNA. They have to go through extensive testing, policy, and procedure to ensure this safety. They don't just throw something together and give it out to the public. It goes through testing to make sure, if you remember from our previous slide, say if you're allergic to mushrooms. Well, if you're eating the squash plant and you are saying, oh, well, I'm allergic to mushrooms, but the squash plant has this same gene as this mushroom. Am I going to be affected? They test specifically for that, allergies and other things, so that when they give it out to the public, someone who's maybe allergic to the mushroom is not going to have an allergic reaction to that squash plant. GMOs are created to fulfill a specific function, either to increase yield, reduce waste, or to resist pests. The idea of it is that if you can make it naturally a pesticide where it releases its own pesticide, you don't have to add something that is a cancer-causing pesticide to it to increase the yield. Now, do some companies still use pesticides and herbicides on these plants? Yes. Like anything that increases profits, this can be abused, but this does not make them inherently bad for you or bad. All right, now that we've gotten some terms out of the way, a plant has essentially 5 basic needs: light, climate, water, soil texture, and container. Each of these 5 needs have some subsections that we will talk about in just a moment. So, light. What do you mean? I stick my plant by a window and it's dying. Why? Well, some plants require an incredible amount of light. We think about where they're from. If we have a succulent, that plant originally would have been native to a desert where it's going to get really strong, intense light all day long. If you notice that you have a succulent and it's by a window and it's starting to get really tall and it is thin and it kind of looks almost like you've stretched it out and it's gotten super thin, this is called getting leggy. It's using its energy to stretch out to find that sun. It gets thin, small, and has sparse leaves. This is because it's not getting enough light. It is using the last of its energy to reach for that light in a last dash effort to find that energy source. This will often cause the plant to eventually die because it's using all of its energy and it's not going to find it. On the other hand, too much light, like us, plants can get sunburned. But unlike us, plants don't heal from that. Our skin produces layer after layer after layer of cells. Once a plant's leaves get burned, it's not going to heal. It can produce new leaves, but that does take some time. And essentially, those leaves are its solar panels, so it gets the energy from that. The solar panels are damaged, it's not going to be able to get enough energy to produce that second leaf to essentially remake a solar panel. Plants can get sunburned inside a house in direct sunlight. When you have a light streaming in through your window, any of us who have cats, where the cat lays in the sun ray, that little ray of sun can actually burn a lot of houseplants. Plants that are not used to that intense sun, and plants that just did not get acclimated or are not native to areas where they would get direct sun. Something like this would be like an African violet, where an African violet is native to Africa and the tropics, where originally it would have had a nice green canopy to filter that sun. If you don't allow it to have that canopy, it's not used to that, so it's going to get burned. Typically, if we have a sunburned leaf, if it is still green in some areas, you would want to leave it because it still is gathering that sun in certain areas. But if it is completely burned, you want to use a pair of clean clippers and clip it off. It'll essentially start to decay, and it can cause disease if you leave it on. But you want to make sure those clippers are clean. Otherwise, you are introducing a new disease or new bacteria into an open wound. Now, I'm sure if any of you have been on Facebook or the internet, rather, there are often pictures that go around saying, oh, check out these no light plants, these plants that can grow in practically no light. That does not mean that they can have absolutely no light. If you have a bathroom that has no window and no grow light, the plants are not going to do well there. I have had several people come up to me and say, hey, well, I had a plant that, survived for 3 years. Well, that's great. It survived for 3 years. That does not mean that it was thriving, and that does not mean it was growing. That means it took 3 years for it to die. What's going on is that the plant in low light is not going to produce any new leaves. And if it is introduced to a infection, a disease, a pest, it will not have the energy reserves to combat that. Light will help it grow. It'll increase its nutrients. It'll give it a fighting chance. You want it to get as much light as it can handle. In a room, much like in this picture, you're going to get direct sunlight, bright and direct light, medium light, and low light. Direct sunlight is that little ray of sun that we talked about earlier that your cat loves to lay in on the floor or wherever it can get into. It's that warm, sunny spot that you can get sunburned in, and so can your plants. A lot of house plants do not like this. However, a lot of succulents that are desert succulents or things like cactuses love that direct sunlight. Pineapples love that direct sunlight. Other plants, and a lot of them, like the bright indirect light where they're not going to get burned, but they're going to get that maximum sun for their reserves. Other plants really like the medium light. They're not intense things. And low light, in my experience, not a lot of plants like the low light. Most of them will tolerate low light, but again, you do want to give your plant as much light as possible because it will use that light to grow. One of the trickiest aspects of this light is the time and duration. Most plants are typically going to need around 8 to 14 hours of light. Some plants require more or less to flower, while others generally just need about 18-14. Some need less, some need more. You really want to think about how much light they get from their native environments. Again, things like African violets are going to want more light because where are they from? Closer to the equator. And that means they're going to get more sun throughout the day. But they're not going to get the intensity of direct sunlight. Other plants don't need that light. And almost every single plant needs at least 8 hours of darkness. Now, would you think, oh, well, how does my plant know that it's dark? Plants can sense it, and they use that time for respiration. There's cam respiration and a bunch of other things that we can go through in another video. Artificial light is in getting into the more scientific aspects of light. Essentially, lumens are going to be the measurement of brightness according to the human eye. Wattage is that measurement of power consumption. You may hear, if you're looking at your light bill, kilowatt per hour. The wattage determines the efficiency and cost of operating the light. Full spectrum lights, and we will go through this in a little bit. They have both red and blue lights, but also green. And this makes them look more like natural light. Full spectrum lights will do a little bit more. It's not just for vegetative growth, but also fruiting growth. Again, plants still need a portion of darkness, but you don't want to put the lights too close because some of the lights will actually produce heat, and this can burn the plants, this can start a fire, this can also simply just heat them up enough to where it starts to evaporate the moisture and dries out the plant. Full sun, partial shade, and shade is often what we'll see on seed packets that we're going to grow outside. Things like tomatoes, spinach, basil, zinnias or cosmos. Full sun is typically reserved for the plants that have fruit-bearing capabilities, so things like tomatoes or squash or pumpkins. They really need all of that strong energy to produce those things, and that's typically 6+ hours of that sun per day. Partial shade is generally where it gets sun for a couple hours, 3 to 6, and then for the rest of the day it is under a tree or under a canopy, so where it's not getting that direct sun and it's shaded. Shade-loving plants are going to have less than 6 hours of sun per day. These are things that are under a tree, under a canopy. They're often sensitive to sun scorch and prefer cooler climates with higher moisture content. The shade decreases the temperature, and as the temperature is decreased, less moisture is evaporated, so it's going to have that higher moisture content. And typically the shade-loving plants are going to be things like your spinach, your leafy greens, bok choy, things like that. Indirect sunlight, maybe something opaque is shielding the plant from the sun's rays. Again, this could be a canopy of trees. This could be a man-made canopy that just blocks that sunlight, just so that the sun is not directly hitting those leaves. Direct sunlight, again, opposite. Nothing is blocking the sun's rays. It is right in that sun, out in the middle of a field, and it is taking that light. So how do we know how much light is too much and how much light is not enough? You're going to be able to look at those plants and see no flower growth, weak growth. It's often going to have, maybe if it's not enough light, it'll have a thin stem, it'll have yellowing, weak leaves, and some stunted leaf growth. Maybe the leaves are smaller than typical, maybe they're more spread out than usual. It's going to look like a sick plant. Too much, you'll often see things drying up. The flowers will shrivel up and die quickly. Leaves will shrivel up and dry. Leaves will also fade in color because it's almost like sun bleached. And leaves will also be drooping. With not enough light, it'll seem more like it's rotting. And with too much light, it'll often seem like it's drying out. If you're not over or under watering it, most likely it's going to be the amount of light that you're giving it. If you don't have a window that provides adequate lighting, like most of us, you're going to want to get some grow lights. You have some different options. Typically, people go between LED and fluorescent. In the past, LEDs used to be super expensive, but due to some recent advancements, that price has gone down a little bit. They generally provide both ends of the spectrum, so you get your vegetative growth and your flowering and all of that. They're going to be a lower wattage, so it costs less for them to run as well, and they have a longer life than fluorescent bulbs, so you're not going to have to keep buying them. These are generally what I would suggest, specifically because the con that it has, that price is being lowered because we've got those recent advancements. With fluorescent lighting, there are less upfront costs, and they're generally better suited for vegetative growth, but they're going to have a higher wattage, meaning if you're going to run them 12 hours a day, in the long term, it's going to cost more. And they have a shorter life than LEDs, so you're going to end up buying more of them. So if you're having a plant within your own home, temperature and humidity are going to be a little bit more forgiving because it's typically a temperature and humidity that is consistent. But you're going to want to take into account, where is this plant native or acclimated to? A lot of tropical plants like warm, humid environments. You'll want to cluster them together to create a microclimate of humidity where each plant gives off a little bit of moisture, and when you cluster them together, that moisture stays together. Kind of like in a small bathroom, it's not going to get a lot of airflow, so that moisture increases, and it's very important to have that fan. Increased humidity does increase the chances of molds. Fungus and gnats love that humid soil. So you're going to want to have a soil that's well drained, but also you'll want to keep an eye on it. When you do water it, each time you're going to want to make sure that soil has dried out. Otherwise, you're going to get a ton of gnats. For succulents, they love that warm, dry air, just like you'd get in that western-facing window, where it's almost always warm and that humidity is going to dry out of the soil. And so oftentimes they're going to actually dry out a little bit faster than your tropical plants because of where you have them, if you have them in a more brighter area. All these still require an airflow to dry out those roots. No plants likes to have their roots wet all the time. For temperature changes, you don't want anything drastic. Think of it like a baby. You don't want to have the AC or heat blowing on it. Both of these things will dry out the plant. A fan will dry out the plant. The dehumidifier will dry out the plant. An open window can also dry out that plant. Now, this is not to say it is, sometimes these things are useful. If you have a plant with gnats and you're keeping an eye on it, you might want to put it maybe by a fan and let it dry out a little bit faster. And then don't leave it there is the one thing. You don't want to leave it there and forget about it. So if you're the type, like myself, where you would forget about it once you sit it there, you're going to come back to a dead plant if you do that. Correct temperature is vital to all stages of growth. With germination, some seeds need to be frozen for a time before waking up from dormancy. This is called cold stratification. Some of them actually need to be scratched or scarred, and that is called scarification for the seed in order to break through that shell. Seedlings, frost can kill the most seedlings at this point, so it's important to harden them off before transplanting them. That means giving them a little bit of sun and then pulling them back and increasing that throughout the day. Heat can also do the same. If it's too warm for them, they may not germinate at all. Things like tomato plants need a little bit of warmth so that they can germinate. Other plants need cold. You'll want to take a look, do some Googling on what specifically your plant and seed type needs. During growth, too much heat can cause a plant to bolt. It essentially means it will shoot up a stem and produce flowers and leaves, and you won't get much harvest, whether it's the leaves or fruit. Flowering as well. A lot of house plants need a certain type of temperature. Maybe they need a trigger So they need a cold period and then a warm period for them to trick them into thinking, oh, we've had a winter, now it's the springtime, now I need to flower. This is super important when you have a plant inside your home, because your house is going to be typically 68 degrees or somewhere around that at a constant temperature. So maybe you take it outside into a cooler area. Maybe you send it to a friend's house who is either a little bit warmer or a little bit colder than you. Things like that. Certain fruits need cool, mild, or hot temperatures to produce fruit. Again, this is something that you'll want to research for your own specific type of seed that you're growing. And saving seeds, they need to be dry. So in the summertime, you'll need it not too hot, otherwise things will just break apart. But if it's too cold, it may retain some moisture. Especially when you're storing these seeds, you want it in a cool, dry place. Otherwise, that heat will actually destroy the seed and it will kill it off before you have time to plant it. As of the spring of 2024, the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map has changed. Conway, Arkansas is now in 8A. This does not mean that they have completely changed everything and things were different from last year. The last year's information was essentially updated. It was based on information that was about 10 years old, and for the past 10 years they've been collecting new data. And finally they've compiled it and they said, hey, nope, this is what it is. Our information is out of date and this is what we are currently working with. So if you think about it and you are one of those gardeners who plants year to year and thinks, well, our last frost date was much earlier than what it was originally saying, that is because they have updated the information and now the USDA plant hardiness zone is more correct, is more up to date. Things change after so many years and we have to account for that. So if you live in Conway, Arkansas, take a look at this map. You can see your little counties here. Faulkner County will be in 8A. This still does not mean to start your tomatoes in January. Unless you have a really good greenhouse and you're willing to keep up-potting that plant and give it some really great light, don't do it. Your plant will get too big and it'll be too unwieldy. And unless you are the type of person who wants to really deal with that, that is a lot to take on. Most of us do not have that kind of time in our life. This is the part where I tell you guys that most of you are probably watering your plant wrong. If you give a little bit of splash of water every single day, that water is going to end up evaporating before the plant gets to it. Or it'll just sit in the dirt and again, evaporate before those roots can take it. My friends who drown their plants and then leave them alone and forget about them, you're probably going to be wondering, my plants do really well. That's because you water them right. You really want to water a plant essentially by drowning it for just a few minutes so that all of that dirt can absorb that water. The entire pot of dirt absorbs water. And then let it drain and you're done. This is most useful when you bottom water a plant, and it essentially means you get a big bowl of water, of lukewarm water, and then you set your pot with holes at the bottom into that pot of water. The water will go up through the drainage holes in the bottom and percolate up towards the base of the plant. And all of that soil will, through essentially pressure, all of that soil will absorb the water. When you have the full container that has moist soil, the roots will be able to grow all throughout the soil. Roots will not grow in dry soil. But, you have to allow the plant to completely dry out to prevent root rot. If you keep watering it every single day like this, kind of like if you spend all day in wet shoes and then the next day you spend all day in wet shoes and you don't let your feet dry out, you're going to have some problem with your feet. And this can eventually cause some more issues, which we'll get to in the next slide. When you give it a splash of water every day, you're not going to fully rehydrate the soil. The roots will not go through the dry soil. You're only going to get a few at the top. This is going to cause your plant to maybe fall over because it's not going to be having deep, strong roots. They're going to be shallow, so you knock it over and it falls over in its pot. It can also cause the water to get hydrophobic, and that's even more of an issue because then you're going to have even less soil that gets wet. Hydrophobic soil is essentially where soil dries out to the point where it stops absorbing water at all. There are ways to get rid of this. They are time-consuming. You can also just change out the soil, but again, that costs money. So to prevent hydrophobic soil, just bottom water your plants about every other week or so. Every week, every other week, whatever it takes to have that plant soil dry out. If you don't let your plant dry out, you're going to be watering it too much. Too much water is going to wash out that nutrients from the soil. It's also going to provide too much water within the pot. Say you don't have drainage holes, and so there's just literally standing water. That is going to cut off oxygen to its roots, and it's going to drown the plant. Too much water also feeds that fungus. Whether it is fungus that is in the dirt that can splash up to the bottom of the leaves, or it is fungus on the sides. Fungus is going to eventually need food, and it's going to eat your plant. Too much water, obviously, like we talked before, is going to rot those roots, and it's going to cause pests to populate that plant. So you're going to get more gnats. If you notice that you have gnats in your plants, it's probably because you're not letting your plant dry out between waterings. Now, on the flip side, lack of or infrequent watering is going to cause bolting. It's going to stress your plant out, and the plant is going to be like, okay, I'm dying, so I'm going to send out some seeds and then die. It's also going to have really slow growth. You're not going to get that big bushy plant, that pothos that's green with a bunch of leaves. You're going to get something spindly, and if it gets damaged, it's not going to be quick to repair itself. You're going to get a decrease in production of fruit because it's not going to be putting its energy into fruiting when it's trying to stay alive. Or the plant will just completely dry up and turn brown. Strangely enough, watering too much or not enough can both cause the plant to wilt. Obviously, not watering enough will cause the plant to wilt because it doesn't have enough water in it to maintain that rigidity, that rigidness that we need. However, when you water it too much, that root rot that we talked about, it being causing root rot, what happens is the roots, again, rot, but then they're not absorbing water. So it may be surrounded in water, but the plant is not going to be able to absorb it. And essentially it is that idea where you're in the middle of an ocean and there's not a drop of water to drink, because it cannot process it. Soil is composed of 3 different types: sand, silt, and clay. A healthy soil also has an ecosystem in itself with good bacteria and decaying matter, but it has 3 different general types of texture. On this chart, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the clay percentage. In Arkansas, we generally have a high percentage of clay. So if we take a look at that 60% right below that percentage, that clay percentage, and follow the line, let's bring it down to 50%. Clay percentage, it's right below the word 50, and we follow the line horizontal. So we've got 50% clay, and we've got, say, 45% silt. We're going to follow it across horizontally into the silty clay area, and where the sign just between 50 and 40, so that's 45. 50 plus 45 is going to equal 95%. We follow that line again, it's right in silty clay, down and to the right, and that's going to tell us it has 5% of sand. Where our target is, it's going to be in that silty clay area. That's going to be our type of clay. There are ways to check your clay and silt and sand amounts. You can check it by sand, and you can also check it via more scientific measures. There are some plants that prefer more acidic or alkaline pHs. Generally, though, most plants will prefer something closest to neutral. Things like blueberries and other hydrangeas, they'll prefer different ones, but as long as you keep it as neutral as possible, and something that is not going to drastically change, say with a hard rain shower, that is going to be the best type, generally for all purposes. So I challenge you to go to your garden store, your neighborhood garden store, and take a look at the pots. You'll notice, if you haven't already, some of them don't have drainage holes. This is going to require knowledge of the amount of water and the timing. The pots with the drainage holes only require timing of water. When you don't have a drainage hole, you have to wait until the whole amount of the water is evaporated, but you don't want to do too much, otherwise you're going to have soil sitting in water, and it will kill the plant because it won't evaporate for several hours, and by then the plant will be dying. Drainage holes are a lot easier to take care of, a lot easier to grow plants in. But Erica, there are so many pots with no holes that are so pretty. Why can't I use this? Is there a way to use them? Absolutely. Plants that don't have holes in them are often called decorative pots. Essentially what you'll do is you'll get a nursery pot that is slightly smaller, that has drainage holes, and you can set it directly into that decorative pot. You won't see the nursery pot, and it's super easy to change them out. You'll essentially just lift the nursery pot with the plant right out of the decorative pot, set it in a bowl or bucket of water, of lukewarm water, let it bottom water up until you can see that top layer of soil getting wet. Let it sit there for a minute, pull it out, let it drain, and then set it back into that decorative pot. Decorative pots can be useful, but you don't want to just sit the plant with the dirt directly into that decorative pot unless you really really know what you're doing. Container size is very, very important. Some plants may not need to be upsized at all. A lot of them are just happy in small pots, or they're happy to be called, or happy to be, quote, root bound. Root bound is essentially when you'll see on the left hand side those two pictures where there are just a ton of roots, barely any soil left. Some plants actually like this, but generally this means that the plant is too big for the pot its size. If your plant is like this and it's not doing well, you'll want to repot it. Generally, you'll want to repot in early spring, just before the growing season. This means that there's going to be less time with excess space in that pot. The empty space and time increases the chance for the soil to stay wet and cause root rot. Only increase the pot size by about 2 to 4 inches in diameter. This is because that is about their root growth for 1 to 2 years. Most plants, you only need to repot them every 1 to 2 years, or if they look like they're really, really stressed. Be sure when you plant and plant things in a container that you account for the size of the roots. Tomato plants typically have tap roots, so you're going to want a pot that is longer than it is wide. This is something that a lot of people end up getting frustrated with because their tomato doesn't grow as big. If you have a really deep pot, that tomato will send that root straight down. Some people also, when they grow tomato plants, instead of growing them straight up and down, what they'll do is they'll plant half of the stem underground, sideways, so that taproot, instead of going up and down, actually goes horizontal. If you don't have a lot of dirt, or if you don't have a very deep raised bed, this is a good idea. Otherwise, planting in a bucket, 2 buckets stacked on top, one without a hole or one without a bottom, that's also possible. Other plants like the wide roots, they're not going to be deep, they're going to be really, really shallow, so they're going to want a wide base. And of course, your pot, the container properties are also going to change the properties of the soil. Terracottas will often, because of their porosity, they'll often dry out the soil much more quickly. Succulents and desert cactuses and all of those plants like the dry soil will absolutely love this. Your tropicals may not. Your tropicals may actually cause molding on the side because you'll be using a soil that retains the moisture. So your clay pots will constantly be absorbing that and may actually grow mold with that. Plastic retains more moisture, so it's going to dry them out a little bit less. This may make your succulents unhappy, but they're also reusable, and you can also rinse them out and scrub them with white vinegar to help them from transferring any diseases or any yucky things that you don't want on your next plant. To review some common mistakes: root rot. If it's wilted, it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs more water. Root rot can happen when you overwater, it damages the roots, and it causes the plant to rot. If your plant is not blooming, it's likely not reaching specific water, light, or temperature needs. You'll want to do a little bit more research on the needs of your specific plant. Succulent is stretching out and thinning out. This is called getting leggy. Your plant will need more light, or more direct sunlight, or more intense light for longer periods of time. If you have it currently in a window, think about getting an LED light that goes on for about 12 hours a day so that it can get the light that it needs. If your plant doesn't look like it's growing, it either needs to be fertilized or it might not be getting enough light. But remember, half of the growth on the plant is actually done underneath the soil. If it doesn't look like it's growing visibly, it may be producing very strong roots that it needs to eventually grow up. And remember, gardening can be very overwhelming. So here are a few tips on how to decrease that sense of stress. Use calendar and phone reminders. We're in an age of technology. Definitely use it. Use it to your advantage. Plant what you love. If you love tomatoes and you're gonna use them, plant them. Don't plant eggplants if you don't care about them. If you are someone who loves to plant herbs and make tea, have an herb garden. You don't necessarily have to plant tomatoes. Start small. Pick a plant that you really like and get really, really good at it. The majority of gardeners that I personally know only know one specific plant, and they're fantastic at them. And that can seem a little bit scary at first when they tell you all of this knowledge that they know, but they may know a ton about tomatoes and nothing about eggplants, or a ton about herbs and nothing about flowers. So try not to have this sense of, oh, well, I don't know everything, so therefore I know nothing. No, start small, learn one thing, and then move on to the next. Using a notebook to journal and write information down is incredible. You can also use an Excel spreadsheet if you're one of our technologically advanced friends. But I've learned having a notebook to journal and write down information down, having just a small one to keep on hand is super useful, and I can keep it with me so I can remember to journal. If you plant from seed or propagate a cutting from a friend's established plant, this will make things a lot more easier. Personally, I hate growing from seed. I would rather use propagation from a cutting to establish the plant. I've always had better luck that way, but if you are someone who wants to see that little itty bitty seed germinate into a seedling and then germinate into a beautiful, gorgeous plant, it is a personal choice, but when you do propagate from a cutting, please make sure you ask the owner first. You don't want to be using dirty seeds, or maybe that plant has a pest or a disease. You want to make sure you ask the owner first. Otherwise, you could be introducing, again, pests, disease, or cutting from that plant could actually kill it. Also, if you ask that friend for advice or just for a cutting, they may be able to give you a lot more information because they've been growing that plant for so long. Join a gardening club and community or a community garden and learn with new friends. The Faulkner County Urban Farm Project is the community garden behind the Faulkner County Library at 1900 Tyler Street, Conway, Arkansas. We have a great amount of volunteers who are absolutely in love with this garden, who care about the garden, and they really want to have a large group of people who also care about this. We will be having a new garden programmer in May of 2024 that will be leading this garden, along with members of our staff who are also very, very interested in seeing this garden thrive. Please keep in mind that if you join something like a Facebook group, there are some people who may be spreading misinformation, so always take some advice with a grain of salt and do your own research. Again, if you need any information, please consult the Dewey Decimal System of 635 in the nonfiction section. This will be your gardening, this will be your house plants, your herbs, your flowers, your pests, everything that you'll really want, 635. Also, if you have any questions, go to your local library and ask around. Librarians are there to help, and they're there to help you learn. So this is the end of our programming. Thank you for all listening for this whole hour. If you are interested in learning more about a garden, please come down to the Faulkner County Library, ask us a few questions, and we're more than happy to help. Thank you, and have a great day.